The air in my grandfather's room was thick with the scent of decay, not just of a body failing, but of a house surrendering to time. It was a smell of dust, dried lavender from forgotten sachets, and the faint, cloying sweetness of medicine. Outside, a humid August afternoon pressed against the windows of the old Victorian home in coastal Massachusetts, the air so heavy it felt like you were breathing water. Inside, the silence was heavier. It was a weighted silence, punctuated only by the shallow, rattling breaths of Arthur Vance, my grandfather, and the gentle whir of an oscillating fan that did little more than stir the stale air. My father, mother, and Aunt Carol stood clustered near the doorway, their postures a study in strained grief. They were here, but not entirely. Their minds were already sifting through the practicalities of death, wills, funeral arrangements, the inevitable division of a long life's acquisitions. I sat in the hard-backed chair beside the bed, the one reserved for the vigil. For 3 days, I'd been its primary occupant. Arthur and I had never been close. He was a figurehead, a patriarch cast in granite and silence. He'd lived his life by a rigid code of privacy and emotional austerity, and he expected the same of us. Conversations with him were like formal interviews, his questions precise, his interest clinical. Yet, in his final days, his gaze kept finding me, a silent, unnerving summons. His hand, a frail claw of paper-thin skin and prominent blue veins, twitched on the chenille bedspread. His eyes, milky with cataracts but still sharp, locked onto mine. "Leo," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The other's out." My father stepped forward. "Dad, we're right here. There's no need." "Out," Arthur repeated, a spark of his old authority flaring in the ruin of his voice. He didn't raise it, but the command was absolute. My father's jaw tightened. He shot me a look, a familiar cocktail of resentment and confusion, before herding my mother and a visibly offended Aunt Carol out of the room, pulling the heavy oak door almost shut behind them. We were alone. The fans seemed to grow louder, a mechanical heartbeat in the quiet room. Arthur's breathing hitched, and he motioned me closer with a slight curl of his fingers. I leaned in, my ear near his lips, the medicinal smell intensifying. "In my desk," he whispered, each word an effort. "Top left drawer, there's a box. Bring it." I navigated the cluttered room, his desk a mahogany beast laden with shipping ledgers, nautical charts, and brass instruments. He'd run a successful import-export business at the port, a legacy inherited and expanded. Finding the small, lacquered box, I brought it back to the bedside. It was surprisingly heavy. He gestured for me to open it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a key. It was unlike any key I had ever seen. Forged from dark, pitted iron, it was long and heavy, with an ornate, almost floral bow and a complex, jagged bit that looked like a miniature cityscape. It felt ancient, powerful. "This," Arthur breathed, his eyes fixed on the key, "is the most important thing I will ever give you, and it is a burden I pray you have the strength to carry." His fingers trembled as he reached out, not to take the key, but to press my own fingers down over it, closing the box. "There is a vault, in the cellar, behind the wine racks. You've likely never seen the door." I had a vague memory of a section of the stone-walled cellar that was always blocked by heavy crates, a part of the house that was simply not used. "What's in it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. His grip tightened on my hand, his knuckles white. A sudden, shocking strength. "Promises and pain. For generations, one Vance has been its guardian. We don't keep people out, Leo. We keep things in. This family, we have a shadow that follows us. A sickness. A curse if you're the poetic type. It's a weakness of the mind, a fragility of the soul. This vault holds the reasons why. It holds the proof of the lengths we've gone to protect our name, to protect ourselves from ourselves." His eyes pleaded with me, a raw, desperate emotion I had never seen in him before. It was terrifying. "The things in that vault, they explain everything. Our misfortunes, the accidents, the family members we don't speak of. But to know is to be infected by it. The knowledge is its own poison. It has broken better men than me. It almost broke me." He coughed, a deep, wet sound that shook his entire frame. I offered him the glass of water, but he waved it away. "Promise me," he gasped, pulling me closer. "Promise me you will take this key and you will throw it into the ocean. Let the sea keep it. Let our secrets die with me. Let this be the end of the guardianship. Let my death be the end of the curse. Promise me, Leo." The intensity of his plea was a physical force. It pinned me to the spot. All my life, I had sought this man's approval, a single word of warmth or pride. Now, in his last moments, he was offering me not a blessing, but a burden disguised as a choice. A choice between ignorance and a truth he claimed was ruinous. "I promise, Grandpa," I said, the words feeling hollow in my own ears. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips. The strength fled his hand, which fell limply to the bed. The tension in his face eased, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it seemed to pull him down into the mattress. "Good boy," he murmured, so faintly I almost didn't hear it. His eyes slid shut. His breathing grew shallower, softer, until in the humming silence of the fan, it simply stopped. I sat there for a full minute, the heavy key still in my hand, my own heart hammering against my ribs. The finality of the moment was an immense, silent bell tolling in the room. Then, the door creaked open. My father stood there, his face pale. He looked from his father's still form to the key in my hand. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. "What did he give you?" Instinctively, my hand closed around the key, hiding it from view. "Nothing," I said quickly. "We were just talking. He's gone." My words set the world back in motion. My father rushed to the bed, my mother's gasp echoed from the hall, and the quiet vigil shattered into the chaotic beginnings of grief. Amid the turmoil, I slipped the iron key into my pocket. It felt like a block of ice against my thigh, a cold, heavy promise I already knew I might not be strong enough to keep. The day of the funeral was draped in a familiar coastal gray. A thick mist rolled in from the Atlantic, muffling the sounds of Marblehead and clinging to the ancient headstones in the cemetery like a shroud. I stood slightly apart from my family, the damp chill seeping into my bones, a physical match for the cold dread coiling in my gut. In my pocket, my fingers were wrapped around the heavy iron key, its jagged edges a constant, secret reminder of my promise. My father, Richard, stood ramrod straight beside my mother, his face a mask of stoic grief that I knew concealed a simmering impatience. Every few minutes, his eyes would flick towards me, a silent, pointed question in their depths. He knew Grandfather had said something important, and my silence was a wall he was already planning how to breach. The wake back at the ancestral home was an exercise in strained pleasantries. Distant relatives I hadn't seen in years moved through the dark-paneled rooms, speaking in hushed tones, their condolences feeling rehearsed. They ate cucumber sandwiches and drank sherry, their conversations carefully skirting the uncomfortable truth that Arthur Vance had been a difficult, guarded man. No one shared fond, lighthearted anecdotes because there were so few to share. I was cornered near the fireplace by my great-aunt, Clara, my grandfather's younger sister. Her face was a delicate web of wrinkles, her eyes cloudy with age but still sharp. "He was always a keeper of burdens, your grandfather," she murmured, her voice thin as parchment. She patted my hand, "even as a boy, especially after Aliner." Before I could ask who Aliner was, my father was there, a plate of untouched pastries in his hand. "Aunt Clara," he said, his voice smooth but with a clear edge of command. "You must be tired. Let me help you to a chair." He shot me a look that was pure venom, a silent, unmistakable order to drop the subject. He led her away, and the name Aliner was left hanging in the air, a ghost suddenly given form. Later that evening, when the last of the mourners had finally departed, the house fell into a profound silence. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, filled with all the things the Vances never said. I retreated to my grandfather's study, the one room that felt like his true sanctuary. The scent of old books, pipe tobacco, and leather hung in the air, a potent distillation of the man himself. I closed the heavy oak door behind me, the click of the latch sealing me in with his secrets. For an hour, I simply sat in his worn leather armchair, The key now resting on the desk in front of me, its dark iron stark against the polished mahogany. I replayed Arthur's last words, his voice raspy and desperate. "This knowledge is a poison, Leo. Let it die with me." The promise felt like a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe. But Aunt Clara's slip had planted a seed of rebellion. Elinor, who was she? What happened to her? Was her story part of the sickness my grandfather had spoken of? My grief was a confusing storm of sorrow and a burgeoning, almost shameful resentment. He had given me an impossible choice: honor his wish and live forever with the gnawing uncertainty, or betray him to uncover a truth he believed would destroy me. He hadn't protected me from a burden. He had handed me one of his own making. Driven by this newfound resolve, I began to search. I wasn't looking for the vault, not yet. I was looking for a reason, a justification to break my promise. I slid open the heavy drawers of his desk. They were meticulously organized. Financial ledgers, property deeds, correspondence with lawyers. Nothing personal. I moved to the bookshelves, my fingers tracing the spines of leather-bound classics and dense historical tomes. Tucked behind a row of maritime histories, I found a collection of old photo albums. I sat on the floor, the lamplight casting a warm glow on the black and white images. There was my grandfather as a young man, lean and serious even then. There were pictures of my father as a boy, looking small and perpetually anxious. Then I found it, a formal family portrait from what looked like the late 1950s. Arthur and his wife stood in the center, flanked by relatives. But on the edge of the group, standing slightly apart, was a young woman with a tentative smile. Her image was vandalized. Her face had been violently scratched out with a fountain pen, the black ink obscuring her features in a chaotic, angry web. Below the photo, a single, elegant script caption remained: "The Vance family, summer 1958. This had to be Elinor." My heart hammered against my ribs. This wasn't just forgetting, this was a deliberate erasure. Tucked into the sleeve behind the photograph was a folded, brittle piece of paper. I carefully unfolded it. It was a copy of the original blueprints for the house, dated 1887. They were intricate, detailed, but my eyes were drawn to a faint, penciled-in annotation in the corner of the plans for the cellar. It was in my grandfather's familiar, spidery handwriting. It simply said, "Check foundation integrity, south wall." Per FV, who was FV? It was another loose thread, another mystery. Clutching the blueprint, I left the study and descended the creaking stairs to the cellar. The air grew cold and damp, smelling of wet stone and earth. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around dusty wooden shelves and forgotten furniture draped in white sheets. It was a crypt for discarded memories. I moved to the south wall, a solid expanse of rough-hewn granite blocks fitted together a century and a half ago. Using the blueprint as a guide, I found the approximate location. Running my hand over the cold, damp stone, it all felt solid. I knocked on one block, then another. The sound was a dull, solid thud. But then, on the third block, the sound changed. It was a hollow, deadened echo, completely different from the others. My breath caught in my throat. My gaze fell upon an old tool chest in the corner. I grabbed a crowbar, its rusted iron cold and heavy in my trembling hands. I wedged the tip into the seam above the hollow-sounding block and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grating screech of stone against stone, the block shifted. I worked the crowbar around the edges, dislodging it until I could pull it free. Behind it was not dirt and earth, but darkness. A void. I pulled out another stone, and then another, my hands scraped and bleeding, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the oppressive silence. Soon, I had revealed the outline of a door. It was made of thick, dark oak, banded with black iron straps, seeming to grow right out of the foundation. And set in the center was a formidable iron lock plate, tarnished with age. The keyhole was intricate, ornate, and unmistakably a perfect match for the key that was now searing a hole in my pocket. I stood there, panting, covered in dust and sweat despite the cellar's chill. My promise to my grandfather screamed in my mind, "Throw it in the sea." The calm, gray Atlantic felt a world away. The vault was right here. The choice was no longer a question of if, but when. The air in the cellar was a physical presence, cold, heavy, and smelling of damp earth and a century of forgotten things. My flashlight beam, a nervous circle of white, trembled on the iron-strapped oak of the hidden door. The key in my palm felt impossibly dense, its weight not just in the cold metal, but in the promise it represented. A promise I was about to shatter. "Throw it in the ocean, Leo. For God's sake, just get rid of it." Grandfather's voice, thin and reedy with his last breaths, was as clear as if he were standing right behind me. His warning echoed off the stone walls, a desperate plea from the grave. "It's a poison. It doesn't fix anything. It only shows you how deep the rot goes." I closed my eyes, the flashlight dipping towards the floor. I could see his face, the papery skin stretched tight over his skull, the sheer terror in his eyes. He wasn't a man who feared anything. Not business rivals, not financial collapse, not illness. But he feared what was behind this door. He feared it enough to beg me, his grandson, to choose ignorance. For a moment, I almost gave in. I could still do it. I could push the loose stones back into place, plaster over the cracks, and no one would ever know. I could get in my car, drive the 2 hours to the Long Island coast, and stand on the windswept shore at Montauk Point. I could pull my arm back and hurl this cursed piece of iron into the churning gray Atlantic, watching it disappear beneath the waves forever. I could keep my promise. I could walk away. But then another image swam up from the depths of my memory, the old photograph from the study. The happy family on the lawn, and the violent, angry scratches that obliterated a young woman's face. Elinor. Great-Aunt Clara's slip of the tongue had given a name to the ghost. This was her tomb. Her history, her story, her very existence had been locked away in the dark, and my family had conspired to forget her. Why? What could a young woman have done to be so thoroughly erased? My father's coldness, his emotional distance, the unspoken sadness that was the true Vance family inheritance, it all started somewhere. Grandfather called it a curse, a sickness. But curses weren't real. Sickness was, and sickness could be understood. It could be diagnosed. Ignorance wasn't a shield, it was a blindfold. And I was tired of walking in the dark. My resolve hardened into a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. I would not walk away. I would not throw it away. I owed it to Elinor. I owed it to myself. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that fogged in the frigid air, I raised the key. My hand was surprisingly steady as I guided its tip into the ornate keyhole. The metal scraped against the lock plate with a sound that set my teeth on edge. I pushed it deeper until it seated with a solid click. Using the fleur-de-lis head for leverage, I turned it. The resistance was immense. For a second, nothing happened. Then came a horrifying, grinding shriek, the sound of rusted tumblers and levers being forced to move for the first time in what must have been 60 or 70 years. It was a sound of violation, of desecration. My knuckles were white as I put all my strength into it, my muscles straining. Then, with a final, deafening clunk that echoed through the small cellar, the mechanism gave way. The lock was open. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden silence. I pulled the key out, its metal now warm from my hand, and shoved it into my jeans pocket. I found the recessed iron ring that served as a handle, its surface pitted and cold. I wrapped my fingers around it, braced my feet on the uneven stone floor, and pulled. The door was monstrously heavy, solid oak reinforced with iron. It didn't budge. Grunting with effort, I leaned my entire body back, digging my heels in. With a low, mournful groan of tortured hinges, it began to move. It scraped against the stone floor, opening inward, inch by painful inch. A different air rushed out to meet me, displacing the cellar's damp chill. This air was dry, stale, and smelled intensely of old paper, decaying leather, and something else, something like dried flowers and faint perfume. It was the scent of preserved time. I shone my light into the abyss. The space was small, a cube of rough-hewn stone, no larger than a walk-in closet. There was no gold, no family jewels, no hidden fortune. Instead, 3 of the 4 walls were lined from floor to ceiling with simple, dark wooden shelves. And on those shelves rested the truth. It was an archive, a library of sorrow. Dozens of thick, leather-bound journals sat in stoic rows, their spines stamped with faded gold initials and years. FE 1928-1935. My great-grandfather, Franklin. AV 1952-1960. My grandfather, Arthur. There were cardboard boxes overflowing with bundles of letters tied with brittle string, their ink faded to a ghostly brown. There were manila folders, thick and bulging, their labels handwritten in a severe, slanted script. I stepped over the threshold, my boots crunching on a fine layer of dust. The heavy door swung slowly shut behind me, not latching, but plunging me into absolute darkness save for the narrow beam of my flashlight. The silence was total, profound. I was in the heart of my family's secret. My light danced nervously across the shelves, a frantic search for a beginning. Franklin, Robert, Arthur, a dynasty of silent men. Where did I start? My eyes scanned the rows of dark green and black ledgers, feeling overwhelmed. Then I saw it. On a shelf at eye level, set slightly apart from the others, was a single book bound not in stern black or green, but in a faded burgundy leather. It was smaller, more delicate. The gold leaf on its cover was still bright, and it was stamped not with initials, but with a name, written in an elegant, flowing script. Eleanor. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it. This was hers. The voice of the girl in the photograph. My hand trembled as I reached out, my fingertips hesitating just before they touched the cover. It felt like a transgression, a violation of a long-enforced silence. But the need to know was a physical ache, a desperate hunger. I slid the journal from its resting place. It felt heavier than it looked, weighted down with ink, with memories, with the full story of why she was erased. I stood there, alone in the dark heart of my family's home, holding the poison my grandfather had warned me about. And I was about to drink it down to the last drop. My fingers, numb from the cold iron of the vault, trembled as I clutched the burgundy journal to my chest. I worked in reverse, my heart hammering against my ribs. The heavy stone slab slid back into place with a grating sound that felt deafening in the sleeping house. I replaced the loose floorboards of the wine rack, the wood groaning in protest. The cellar returned to its state of benign neglect, the only evidence of my trespass the dust on my jeans and the frantic pulse in my throat. I had broken my promise. The poison was in my hand. I couldn't stay in that damp, cold space, a place that now felt like a tomb. I ascended the creaking wooden stairs, each step an accusation. The house above was dark and silent, a sleeping giant holding its breath. My parents' room was down the hall, the door closed. A sliver of guilt cut through my adrenaline. My father, with his suspicious eyes and simmering resentment, was a product of this secrecy. How much did he know? Did he resent my grandfather for passing this burden to me, or for never trusting him with it in the first place? There was only one place I could go. I padded softly down the carpeted hallway to my grandfather's study. Pushing the heavy oak door open, I was met with the familiar scent of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco, the ghost of Arthur himself. I clicked on the small green banker's lamp on his desk, casting a pool of intimate light over the polished wood surface. It was here, in this very chair, that my quest had begun with a faded blueprint. Now, I held what felt like the conclusion. I sat down in his large leather chair, the worn material sighing under my weight. For a long moment, I just stared at the journal. It felt warm now, or maybe it was just the heat of my own anxious hands. The cover was simple, unadorned except for the name stamped in faded gold foil, Eleanor. A name spoken in a whisper at a funeral, a face violently scratched from a photograph. A ghost I was about to invite into the room. With a deep, shaky breath, I opened it. The first page was dated, September 5th, 1948. The handwriting was nothing like my grandfather's rigid, forceful script. It was elegant, fluid, with confident loops and a slight rightward slant. It was alive. Arthur came home today, the first entry began. The train was late, but I didn't mind the wait. The autumn air feels different this year, cleaner, hopeful. He looks older. The war carved new lines into his face, around his eyes. He's quieter, too. Mama cried, and Papa shook his hand so hard I thought he might break his wrist. But later, when we were alone on the porch, I told him his uniform was drab, and I saw it. A flicker of the old Arthur, the boy who used to chase me through the woods with lightning bugs in a jar. He almost smiled. I think he's still in there. I'll find him. I read on, mesmerized. Chapter by chapter, Eleanor painted a portrait of a world I'd only seen in black and white films. She wrote about the crisp New England autumns, the excitement of going to a picture show in town, the suffocating expectations placed on a young woman of her time. She was sharp, witty, and possessed a deep-seated curiosity that I recognized in myself. She was the vibrant color missing from my family's monochrome history. Her entries about Arthur were filled with a tender, sisterly frustration. She tried to pull him back into the light, to get him to talk about what he'd seen, but he remained distant, building the walls that would one day define him. Then, the tone began to shift. The entries from the winter of 1949 grew less concerned with dances and more with the atmosphere in the house. The focus became her father, my great-grandfather Thomas, a man I knew only as a stern-faced portrait in the hallway. January 12, 1949. Papa has locked himself in the workshop again. He calls it a workshop, but it's more like a laboratory now. Since he lost the contract with the War Department, he's been adrift. Now he has this new project, the Echo Box, he calls it. He speaks of it in grand terms, that it will revolutionize communication, that it will make the telephone obsolete. But his eyes have a feverish glint I don't like. Mama says to let him be, that genius needs its space. But genius doesn't usually sound like humming and static at 3 in the morning. February 3rd, 1949. I tried to ask Arthur about it. He works with Papa now, hauling equipment, soldering wires. He's found a new kind of duty. When I told him I was worried, he got angry. He's a great man, Eleanor. You wouldn't understand the science. He said it with such condescension, as if my mind were only suited for fabrics and recipes. The chasm between us grows wider every day. He guards Papa's obsession like a soldier at his post. My own hands grew cold as I read. I could feel the creeping dread seeping through the pages, a 70-year-old fear that felt utterly fresh. The journal entries became shorter, more frantic. Eleanor wrote of her father's gaunt appearance, of his paranoid muttering about resonances and imprints. The family sickness? It wasn't a weakness of the mind. It was an idea, an obsession, and it was starting to infect all of them. The final entry I read that night was from a date that stood starkly on the page. April 16th, 1949. The handwriting was shaky. The ink bled in places as if from a trembling hand or a fallen tear. I couldn't sleep. The humming from the barn was louder tonight, a discordant drone that vibrated in my teeth. I had to know. I slipped out, the wet spring grass cold on my bare feet. The workshop door was ajar. Papa never leaves it ajar. Inside, God, the air was thick, electric. In the center of the room was his machine. A monstrosity of copper coils, vacuum tubes, and dials, all focused on a central crystal that pulsed with a sickening, faint green light. His notebooks were spread open on a bench, and I read them. My blood ran cold. He lied to all of us. The Echo Box isn't for communication. It's not for sending anything, it's for listening. He believes strong emotional events, trauma, fear, rage, leave a permanent psychic imprint on a location. An echo, he thinks he can tune his machine to these echoes, to hear them, to see them. His notes were full of mad ramblings about the old bank robbery, the haunting at the Miller place. He thinks he can witness events long past. But the last page was the most terrifying. He's not just tuning it to places anymore. He's trying to tune it to people, to the recently deceased. He thinks he can hear their last living thoughts. Papa hasn't built a radio. He's built a machine to rob graves. I slammed the journal shut. The sound cracked through the silence of the study. My breath came in ragged gasps. The room suddenly felt colder, the shadows deeper. This was the poison. Not a mental illness passed through blood, but a tangible, terrible secret locked away in the cellar. A secret built of copper wire and stolen echoes. My grandfather hadn't been guarding against a curse. He'd been guarding a machine. And the woman who discovered its true purpose was named Elinor. The phrase hung in the silent study, thick and suffocating. A machine to rob graves. My blood ran cold, the words echoing the chilling finality of my grandfather's voice. This wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, horrifying description. The storm outside seemed to pause, the rain holding its breath as I stared at the page, my knuckles white where I gripped the journal. The curse, the sickness that ran through my family, it wasn't genetic. It was a machine, a secret locked in the cellar, guarded by a man who had dedicated his life to containing its poison. My hands trembled, but I couldn't stop. I had to know how it ended. I turned the page, my heart hammering against my ribs. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. The elegant, flowing script was gone, replaced by jagged, frantic letters that clawed at the paper. October 12, 1948. He did it. God help us, he did it. Father couldn't wait. His grief, it's been a bottomless well since Mother passed. He spoke of her constantly, of her last moments, of the things left unsaid. He convinced himself this machine, his monstrous echo box, was a gift, a way to say goodbye, a way to hear her voice one last time. I begged him not to. Arthur tried to reason with him, his voice low and steady, but Father was beyond reason. He looked at us with hollow eyes and accused us of trying to keep him from her. Last night, he locked himself in the laboratory. Arthur and I stood outside the door, listening to the hum of the machine powering up. It was a low, guttural sound, like a beast waking from a long slumber. Then, silence. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope it had failed, that his obsession had amounted to nothing more than a heap of useless wires and tubes. Then came the scream. It wasn't from Father. It was a chorus, a cacophony of sound that seemed to press out through the very wood of the door. It wasn't a voice. It was everything else. It was the memory of pain from her sickness, the fear of leaving us, the sudden, shocking silence of the end. It was fragmented images, flashes of feeling, the warmth of a summer afternoon, the sting of a cold word, the terror of a final, rattling breath. It was a lifetime of thoughts, joys, and agonies unleashed at once without context or order. A psychic tidal wave, an echo of a soul being torn apart, and in the middle of it all, we heard Father. He wasn't screaming. He was weeping. A broken, animal sound of a man who had not found his wife, but had been drowned in the chaos of her departure. Arthur kicked the door in. The room stank of ozone and something else, something like scorched memory. The machine was glowing faintly, a coil of copper wire at its heart pulsing with a sickly green light. Father was on his knees, clutching his head, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was muttering her name over and over, but he was also talking to people who weren't there. He was reliving moments from his childhood, from the war, from his wedding day, all jumbled together. The machine hadn't just let him hear Mother's echo, it had shattered the walls in his own mind. Arthur's face was a mask of stone. I'd never seen him like that. The brother I knew, the one who would tease me and protect me, was gone. In his place was a soldier facing an enemy he couldn't shoot. He walked past me, past our weeping father, and picked up a heavy iron wrench from the workbench. He didn't hesitate. He brought it down on the machine again and again. Glass shattered, wires snapped. The green glow died with a final, pathetic flicker. He destroyed it completely, methodically, until it was nothing but a pile of junk on the floor. He turned to me, his face grim. "He can't be helped," he said, his voice flat. "But we can be. No one can ever know what this was, what it did." As of this moment, our father fell ill. His mind simply broke. "Do you understand me, Elinor? It's a sickness, a weakness of the mind. That is the only story, the only truth." I had to pause, my breath catching in my throat. This was it. The birth of the lie. The moment my grandfather, Arthur, became the guardian. He wasn't protecting a fortune, he was burying a catastrophe. I read on, the final entry filling me with a profound, aching sadness. October 15th, 1948. They took father away this morning. He didn't recognize me. He smiled a vacant smile and spoke about the weather in 1923. Arthur handled everything. He was so efficient, so cold. He has already begun to build the vault, a tomb for a secret. We argued last night. I told him we had to destroy the notes, the blueprints, everything. I said this knowledge was the real poison. He looked at me, and for the first time, I was afraid of my own brother. He said destroying the research was foolish. What if it could be understood, controlled? What if it held a power that needed to be guarded, not erased? I saw the trap then. He wasn't just burying the failure, he was preserving the possibility. He believes he can contain it. He believes he is strong enough. He gave me a choice. I could accept the new truth, the story of our father's madness, a story that would now hang over our family for generations as a hereditary curse. Or, he said, I could share my father's fate. He would tell the doctors that the shock had broken my mind as well, that I was prone to the same fantasies. He would have me committed. He would erase me to protect the secret. He called it protection. I call it a prison, so I am choosing a third option. I am leaving. I will disappear. I will become the ghost that he wishes I was. I don't know where I'll go, only that I cannot stay here. I cannot live inside his lie. I am leaving this journal in the vault. It is the only witness left. Perhaps one day, someone will find it and understand that our family is not cursed. We are haunted, haunted by something we built ourselves. Goodbye, Arthur. I hope you can live with what you've done. That was the last entry. I closed the journal softly, the leather cover cool beneath my fingertips. The silence in the study was immense, filled only by the soft drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. I finally understood. The scratched-out face in the photograph, the whispers of a forgotten name, the crushing, lifelong burden my grandfather carried. He wasn't a stern, unfeeling man. He was a sentinel, standing guard over a truth so toxic it had destroyed his father and banished his sister. He had spent his entire life making sure the poison never leaked out again. A floorboard creaked downstairs. My father. My blood turned to ice. My grandfather had passed the key, the burden, the curse to me, and now I was the one who knew. The burgundy leather of the journal felt cold under my fingers, a stark contrast to the heat rising in my face. I sat in my grandfather's worn armchair, the air thick with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, a ghost of the man who had orchestrated this entire tragedy. The story wasn't ink on a page anymore. It was a living, breathing thing coiled in the pit of my stomach. Elinor wasn't a forgotten relative, she was a sacrifice. The curse wasn't a sickness, it was a lie, a shield forged from cruelty to hide a truth far more terrible. The study door creaked open. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. My father's presence had been a shadow at the edge of my awareness for the past hour, a circling hawk of suspicion. I'd felt him pacing in the hall, his footsteps heavy with a lifetime of unspoken anxieties. Leo! His voice was strained, stripped of its usual gruffness. I've been looking for you. What are you doing in here? I slowly closed the journal, placing it deliberately on the mahogany desk beside me. My movements felt slow, weighted, as if I were moving underwater. Just thinking. He stepped fully into the room, his eyes, so much like my own, darting from my face to the journal and back again. The quiet suspicion that had simmered at the wake had now boiled over into raw, undisguised concern. He looked older than he had that morning, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by a fear I was only now beginning to understand. "You've been different since he died," David said, his voice low. "Ever since he spoke to you alone. He gave you something, didn't he? In that room." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. He wasn't just asking about the key, he was asking about the shift he felt in the family's delicate, broken balance. I was holding a piece of the puzzle he'd spent his entire life trying to solve, and he knew it. "He told you something," he pressed on, taking another step closer. "About the sickness, about what's wrong with us." That phrase, "what's wrong with us," hit me like a physical blow. He had lived his entire 60 years believing he was flawed, a carrier of a genetic time bomb, waiting for the day his mind would betray him just as he believed it had betrayed his grandfather. He had raised me under that same shadow, a constant, oppressive fear that had shaped every major decision in his life, and by extension, my own. In that moment, the lie Arthur had built felt more monstrous than the machine that had started it all. My grandfather's warning echoed in my head. The truth is a poison, Leo. Let it die with me. But looking at my father, at the desperate hope and terror warring in his eyes, I realized that the lie was a poison, too. A slow-acting one that had been killing him from the inside out for decades. He didn't tell me anything, I said, my voice hoarse. I stood up, picking up the journal. She did. I held it out to him. He stared at it, his brow furrowed in confusion. What is that? It's a journal. It belonged to Elinor. The name hung in the air between us. His confusion deepened. Elinor? Who's Elinor? Your aunt, I said softly. Grandpa's sister, the one he erased. My father flinched as if I'd slapped him. He took the journal from my hand, his fingers tracing the gold-embossed name. He opened it, his eyes scanning the elegant, looped cursive of the first page. He didn't read it, not really. He was just confirming it was real. This isn't possible, he whispered, shaking his head. He never had a sister. He did, I said, my resolve hardening, and she knew everything. And so I told him. Standing in the silent judgment of my grandfather's study, I unraveled the 50-year-old lie. I told him about his grandmother's death, about his grandfather's grief-fueled obsession, and about the terrible invention built in the name of love, the Echo Box. I described the catastrophic night it was used, the flood of chaotic thoughts that shattered a man's mind, and the subsequent cover-up. My father sank into the armchair I had just vacated, the journal limp in his lap. He listened without interruption, his face a canvas of shifting emotions. Disbelief gave way to a dawning, horrified understanding. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pallor that was almost gray. He destroyed it, I finished, my voice raw. Arthur saw what happened to his father and he smashed the machine, but he was terrified. He thought it proved that listening to the dead would drive anyone insane. So he created the story of a hereditary illness. And to protect that secret, he forced Elinor to disappear. He threatened her with an asylum if she ever told anyone the truth. He buried her alive to protect a lie. The silence that followed was heavier than any before it. It was a vacuum, filled with the ghosts of a life that could have been. My father wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the wall, at a portrait of his own father, Arthur, looking stern and resolute even in oil paint. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken rasp. All my life. He swallowed hard, a dry, rattling sound. All my life, I've been afraid. I didn't take that job in California because I was scared to be too far from my doctors. Your mother and I, we almost didn't have you, Leo. We were so afraid of passing it on. A single tear traced a path through the dust of years on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was one of pure, bottomless rage. He surged to his feet, his body trembling. That bastard, he choked out, his gaze fixed on the portrait. That manipulative, cruel bastard. He took a step toward the painting, and for a second, I thought he was going to tear it from the wall. But his shoulders slumped, and the rage collapsed into something far worse, a hollow, echoing grief. The fight went out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of a stolen life. It was all for nothing, he whispered, turning back to me, his eyes pleading, searching for an anchor in the wreckage. The fear, the precautions, the whispering, it was all just a story he told. The poison of the truth wasn't madness. It was this. It was the complete and utter annihilation of a man's past, the foundation upon which he had built his entire identity. My grandfather hadn't just hidden a secret, he had stolen his own son's peace of mind. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. "What have you done, Leo?" he asked, his voice devoid of anger, filled only with a terrifying emptiness. "He gave you that key to bury it forever. Why didn't you listen?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the study, leaving the journal on the chair. He didn't slam the door. He closed it softly, a gesture of finality that was more chilling than any shout. I was alone again, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I had freed my father from one prison only to lock him in another. The truth was out, the poison released, and I, the new guardian, had absolutely no idea what to do with the devastation it had left behind. The silence that followed my confession was a living thing. It filled the study, pressing in on us, heavier than the decades of lies it had replaced. My father, David, sat motionless in Arthur's worn leather armchair, his face a mask of hollowed-out shock. He wasn't angry anymore. The fury had burned out, leaving behind the cold, gray ash of betrayal. The truth I had unleashed wasn't a cleansing fire. It was the poison my grandfather had warned of, and it was now coursing through my father's veins. He had spent his entire life walking on eggshells around a phantom illness, a hereditary doom that dictated his choices, stole his joy, and defined his relationship with his own father. And it was all a lie. A cruel, elaborate fabrication designed by a terrified young man to bury an even darker secret. The weight of that realization had broken something in him. I could see it in the vacant stare he fixed on the far wall, as if watching the film of his life play back, now revealed as a tragedy of errors. Guilt was a physical weight in my chest. I had broken my promise and, in doing so, had shattered my father's world. For a day, we moved through the old house like strangers, the air thick with unspoken grief. But I couldn't let this be the end. The poison was out, yes, but an antidote had to exist. It had to. The answer wasn't in the lie, but in the person the lie was created to erase, Eleanor. My purpose shifted. I was no longer just the keeper of a secret, but the seeker of a resolution. I returned to the cold, damp air of the vault, the iron key feeling different in my hand, no longer a burden but a tool. This time, I searched not for a grand revelation, but for a practical clue. Arthur was a man of meticulous control. He wouldn't have just cast his sister into the void without keeping some record, some thread of connection he could hold, even if he never pulled on it. In a dusty corner, behind a stack of brittle ledgers, I found it, a small steel lockbox. It was plain, functional, and locked tight. I remembered a small key I'd seen in the back of my grandfather's desk drawer, one that fit no other lock in the house. My heart hammered as I retrieved it and returned to the cellar. It turned. Inside, the contents were sparse but telling. There was a birth certificate for one Eleanor Mayhew, a social security card, and a series of bank passbooks from a small credit union in Burlington, Vermont. The passbooks showed regular, substantial deposits made every quarter for nearly 60 years, the last one just 3 months ago. And with them, a single slip of paper with a handwritten address. I brought the box upstairs and placed it on the desk in front of my father. He didn't look at it. "What is this, Leo? More ghosts?" His voice was raspy, unused. "It's a lead," I said, my own voice steady with newfound resolve. "An address. In Vermont. I think she's alive, Dad. I think we can find her." He finally looked at me, his eyes clouded with a pain so deep I almost looked away. "And what's the point? To see what another one of Arthur's lies looks like. It's too late. Everything is too late." "It's not," I insisted, leaning forward. "The curse was never real, but she is. Eleanor is real. A real person we were robbed of knowing. We can't get the years back, but we can give her back her name. We can give her back her family." For a long moment, he was silent. Then a flicker of something, not hope, but perhaps a need for something tangible to anchor his shattered reality, appeared in his eyes. He slowly nodded. "All right, we go." The drive north was a long, shared silence. We watched the dense forests of New York give way to the rolling green mountains of Vermont. The scenery was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in the car. But as the miles passed, the suffocating silence began to thin. My father spoke first, his voice quiet. He was always so afraid. I thought it was of the sickness, but he was just afraid of the truth getting out. We talked about Arthur, not as a monster or a saint, but as a flawed, terrified man who had made an impossible choice and lived with it every single day. We talked about the life my father had lived, the anxieties and the missed opportunities. It was a painful, raw conversation, but it was the most honest one we'd ever had. We found the address on a quiet, tree-lined street in a small town outside Burlington. It was a modest cottage, painted a cheerful blue, with a garden full of late-blooming roses. An elderly woman with a shock of white hair was on her knees, tending to them, her back to us. As we approached on the stone walkway, she slowly pushed herself up and turned. Her face was lined with the map of a long life, but her eyes, they were the same bright, intelligent eyes from the photograph. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clear but cautious. My father couldn't speak. I stepped forward. "Are you Alina Mayhew?" She stiffened, a flicker of old fear crossing her features. "I am. My name is Leo," I said gently. "This is my father, David. We're Arthur's family." The name hung in the air. Her composure, a shield built over 60 years of exile, finally cracked. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at my father, truly seeing him for the first time. "David," she whispered, the name a relic from a forgotten life. "You have his eyes." She invited us inside. Over cups of tea in a sunlit living room filled with books and art, she filled in the final gaps. She spoke of Arthur not with hatred, but with a complex, sorrowful understanding. He had visited her, in secret, only a handful of times in 6 decades. Each visit was strained, full of regret he could never voice. He had ensured her financial security, but had sentenced her to a life of profound loneliness. She had built a new life, a quiet one, but she had never stopped being Alina, the sister who was erased. She showed my father a small photo album. In it were pictures of a life lived in parallel, Alina celebrating holidays alone, standing by the ocean, growing old in quiet dignity. My father stared at the images of the aunt he should have known, the woman who should have been at his wedding, who should have met his son. The loss, once an abstract concept, was now a tangible, heartbreaking reality. We drove home in a different kind of silence. It wasn't empty or tense, but full. Full of grief, of understanding, and of a fragile, emerging peace. We hadn't just found a long-lost relative, we had reclaimed a piece of our family's soul. Back in my grandfather's study, the air felt lighter. I found my father standing by the fireplace, holding the old framed photograph with the scratched-out face. He carefully removed it. From his pocket, he took a small photo Alina had given him, a picture of her as a vibrant young woman, her smile unburdened by the future. He slid it into a simple silver frame and placed it in the center of the mantelpiece. Alina was home. He turned to me, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "Thank you, Leo." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. He wasn't just thanking me for finding her. He was thanking me for having the courage to face the truth he couldn't. The key my grandfather gave me hadn't unlocked a curse. It had unlocked a cage. The poison of the truth had been agonizing, but the antidote was connection. It was sitting with my father in the quiet study, the silence finally comfortable, and beginning the slow, painful, and necessary work of rebuilding our family, not on a foundation of fear, but on the bedrock of an honest, shared history.